Hello there and welcome back to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and if you're new to this channel, what we do here is we talk about a few things hobby related. So sometimes we take a topic from the hobby, whether it's a lore video, a book review, or a retrospective of the hobby itself, or maybe a talk about the future of certain things, and we paint a model that's somewhat related to the topic of the video, and we paint it up, have a chat. It's all very entertaining and very fun, I hope, for you guys here. For those of you who do know how this works, I have to reiterate it for everyone just in case. So today we're going to do a lore video. I don't do a lot of these, but I might do a few more of them because you guys seem to like them quite a lot. But as I always do with my lore videos, I try to take a slightly more broad church approach to things. So it's more cause and effects, what happens in a big picture perspective of the events as they take place. And today we're talking all about the World Eaters and their Primarch Angron, and were they the most tragic of all the legions? And well, hopefully by the end of this video we will be a bit closer to answering that question. And today's video we are going to be painting this model right here. Yes, a possessed Chaos Space Marine that will be in classic World Eaters. Well, I say classic, the red version. Not the white version, unfortunately, because white's hard to paint and I don't want to paint white on camera because I'm going to embarrass myself. But in any case, I'm sure it's going to be entertaining. So without further ado, let's crack on. You probably already have a pretty fixed idea of what you think the World Eaters Legion are like in your head. World Eaters very much are bloodthirsty, barbaric slaughter machines driven by the desire to slaughter everything in range and kill anything that they perceive as a threat, maybe even a friend. But the thing about the World Eaters is that that's not how they started, and that isn't really the way they were ever meant to be either. And when we look at this in a broader perspective, the World Eaters unfortunately were one of those legions which very much was shaped by circumstance and by a lot of misfortune. And you can't really talk about this when it comes to the World Eaters without starting with Angron. So that's where we're very much going to start today, with a bit of old school great man history. Now, for anyone who's read the book Betrayer or the Angron novel, you'll very much know that he was found on the planet of Nanurcia and was raised as a slave in a gladiatorial school before eventually being subjected to the Butcher's Nails, the trademark that haunts both him and his legion. Now, the thing about Angron is that not only did he manage to escape from his situation and lead his people and his friends away from the slavers of Nanurcia, he was also found by the Emperor at the best possible time. And as a quick recap, obviously the Emperor found him. Angron didn't want to leave his friends, so the Emperor left them and took Angron. Now, if we break this down a little bit and actually think about this in a broader perspective, Angron was shown very quickly that the only thing keeping him alive was the Butcher's Nails. He wasn't actually a functioning Primarch even at the time that the Emperor found him. And if the Emperor had found him just a little bit earlier, he would have had a very different man on his hands. Angron was cunning, he was clever, he was intelligent, possibly one of the most intelligent of the Primarchs before he was subjected to the Butcher's Nails, but all that was dashed and taken away from him. There's a lot of speculation that the Emperor created all the Primarchs for different purposes, and that's clearer for some than for others. It's never really been clear what Angron's role should have been, and even if you look at what his legion were good at before they were reunited with their Primarch, it's still quite hard to put your finger on it, but you imagine it would have been something not too dissimilar to what legions such as the Space Wolves or the Lunar Wolves were when they were reunited, and what their purpose was when they were created by the Emperor. But obviously all that was thrown out the window. And if we go back to Angron very quickly, well, I say very quickly, we're going to be on him for a little while now. The first thing to remember about Angron is that so much of his personality was stripped away when the nails were stuck in his head. He lost himself to it. He lost who he was. A lot of his memories were taken away. A lot of what he considered himself to be was completely destroyed. I mean, you have to remember that the nails caused him endless pain. So even though he did escape with his friends and he was able to get out of the trap set by the slavers, it's very unlikely that he considered a future that was going to be particularly bright or particularly positive for himself or for his friends. And it is fair to say that it's likely that Angron himself wholeheartedly expected to die at the hands of the slavers rather than be recaptured, because the agony of the nails quite clearly was one of the biggest things that was driving him insane. It's likely that he wanted a way out, a way for it all to end. And people think that the Emperor was to blame for taking him away, which he was, but there might be more to it than it just being about him wanting to fall with his friends. When he was taken, the Emperor didn't take any of his friends with him. Obviously, these were all humans who, for the most part, would have been too old to become Space Marines themselves, but the nails had already damaged them beyond repair themselves, so they would have been as much of a liability as Angron proved to be later on anyway. and his legion as an extension of that. So he left them behind. But not only did this mean that Angron lost all of his friends, he was also cheated out of the death he wanted. He was cheated out of what he considered to be the ending that suited him. He knew very much that life with the nails in his head was never going to be a good thing. He knew that he was unlikely to have a decent future, and it's kind of understandable and somewhat relatable when you're feeling that hopeless to actually just want a way out. And the way out that he wanted for himself was not the one the Emperor provided. But then we have to think about the influence that Angron had on his legion. And this is where we start to see more of a spread in terms of the influence of not only Angron, but also his legion. As I said earlier, it's very hard to pin down what the purpose for the Warhounds, as they were known before they became the World Eaters, was. But one of the things we have to remember is that in the timeline, Angron was found quite late. It's hard to know if the things that befell the unknown Primarchs had happened before or after this event. But having said that, the thing to bear in mind with Angron himself is that when he joined his legion, he changed them himself. They were bent to his will, and very much for the worst. The Warhounds were very much considered a respectable legion who were all about firm brotherhood. And the other thing you have to remember about the legions themselves, if we divert to them for a second, is that the legions before the Primarchs started reuniting with them were all far more there was more camaraderie and more companionship between the legions. Now, obviously, as Primarchs were discovered, the legions themselves were suddenly swayed more so by the Primarchs, who actually they came to serve. But before then, a lot of the legions found far more common ground between each other, and that didn't start to change until more than half the Primarchs were found. Look at the Death Guard, the Iron Warriors, the Iron Hands, and even the Salamanders as great examples. All these legions were changed, some would say for the better and some would say for the worst, by the Primarchs that founded them, and the Night Lords as well. And they had good cordial relationships with warriors and officers from other legions. All the legions were led by legionaries at one point or another, with the obvious exception of the Sons of Horus, because Horus was found so early. But they were all led by legionaries. There was more of a sense of brotherhood between the legions. There was far more equality, for want of a better word, and a far greater equity between the hierarchs of the legions before the Primarchs. And when the Primarchs came to it, they obviously changed that. Now, we're not focusing on the Primarchs as a whole here, obviously, but this is just to give you some context. Every other legion bends their Primarch's will, so obviously the World Eaters, before they became the World Eaters, were no exception. Now, Angron did something which the other Primarchs didn't do, and he obviously killed in cold blood quite a few of his legion officers without realising potentially who they were. Now, as controversial and problematic as that was, and that really should have been the tip for the Emperor to know that Angron wasn't going to be as useful as he thought he might be, that's a big shift. That doesn't happen anywhere else, at least not until Istvan comes around. And ultimately, the other thing that for us to bear in mind when we then think back to this and how this affects the Legion is that meant that everyone within the Legion was not safe. And that's probably a unique case where no one within the Legions, no one within the World Eaters or the Warhounds was safe when their Primarch was around, and that was quite a terrifying thing. Now, if we then think about how this then affected the Legion, and it may have put them in a bit of a rock and a hard place when it came to the butcher's nails that Angron put upon them. It was either potentially be wiped out or, destroyed by their own Primarch, or maybe the Emperor further down the line, or acquiesce to their Primarch and hope that did something. And it's fair to say that the Warhounds did try quite hard to please Angron. They wanted to be the sons that they thought they needed to be, but obviously by this point Angron himself was too far gone. And if we skip back to Angron, it does say quite a lot that even though he was in charge of the Legion, he never seemed to connect with them the way other Primarchs connected with their legions. If we look at other Primarchs such as Jagatai Khan, or even Lionel Johnson, or Guilliman, or Horus, or any other Primarch, who all had fairly positive and cordial relationships with their legionaries, and even some of the more distant ones, such as Ferrus Manus, or Perturabo, possibly even Alpharius, who all have very different kinds of relationships with their legionaries. It's very clear that they were still on amicable enough terms that they knew how to get the best out of their legionaries, rather than treating them like they were an unwanted inconvenience. But with Angron, that was obviously not the case. But now when we think about this in terms of what this meant, is that the World Eaters themselves, that relationship which they probably would have cultivated with the other legions, also began to change when they themselves were forced to change by Angron. a lot of the cordialness, a lot of the camaraderie, a lot of the companionship and the brotherhood that the Warhounds held with other legions began to disappear quite slowly, making them a more and more isolated force that began to resent both their Primarch potentially, but also the other legions for seeing them as outcasts and outsiders. Now, there have always been slightly more outsidery legions in the Imperium at large. You can see especially that in the White Scars, the Raven Guard, and arguably the Alpha, and definitely the Alpha Legion, but also arguably the Death Guard, who have all very much been on the fringes of the social circle of the Primarchs, never really having any real friends. But when we then think about that to the legions, that was different because of how they were raised and how they were mustered, all from the same source, and were very much on campaign together before the Primarchs came around. To return to that point briefly. And obviously for the World Eaters, that was not such a good thing, because they began to lose what little connection they did have and were stuck more and more with a Primarch that they themselves probably didn't particularly consider stable. And ultimately, it wouldn't be that surprising to think that many within the World Eaters themselves wouldn't have wanted to stick around with the World Eaters Legion themselves if they could have avoided it. And then this brings me on to another parallel the World Eaters have with another legion, the Night Lords, the 8th Legion, who, like the others, all began very much as the paragons of humanity, the greatest soldiers in the armies of the Emperor, but were slowly subverted and changed by their Primarch's influence. The criminals from Nostoramo being brought into the Legion, turning it into a Legion designed mainly for fear and for terror tactics, was one thing. And for the World Eaters, who were very much a Legion that were all about a close-knit brotherhood, being turned into effectively monsters in the eyes of both their contemporary Space Marines and the Imperium at large, definitely would have fostered a lot more resentment within the individual legionaries, not just their command structure. And then we then think about how that translates very easily into the heresy. It was never really that hard for Angron to make the choice. Ultimately, he did still feel betrayed by the Emperor. He obviously still felt a lot of resentment for having lost his family in his own eyes. And also, he was never granted a way out. He would have just kept serving the Emperor and probably never would have been able to leave that servitude for as long as he lived. Whereas with Horus, he might have received that freedom, and in many respects, he actually did. But then when we think about that, how that translates later on into the heresy, in that Angron himself clearly didn't care a huge amount about his legion by the time of the heresy, considering that he was openly forcing his warriors into dangerous situations across their campaigns, and was even executing them when they failed to meet his almost unrealistic expectations. In many ways, that's also not a massive surprise unto itself, because Angron was not happy to be in charge of a legion. He did not want that. And being the reluctant Primarch in that situation also makes it a lot harder for him to then relate to his legionaries in many other ways. So ultimately, this also leads us on to the next bit, is when the heresy happened, it's not that surprising that when Angron joined Horus, a very big chunk of his legion rebelled against him. You've got to remember that becoming a member of the World Eaters did not mean automatically wanting to have the butcher's nails, did not mean you automatically wanted to become a killing machine. And because the World Eaters themselves did not have a planetary culture that the legions shared in common, the way that Mortarion had with Barbarus or Guilliman had with Macragge and Ultramar at large, it meant that the legion itself was a far bigger mix of cultures, which obviously meant there was no unifying factor apart from their own mutilation at the hands of a Primarch. And because the mutilation itself is such a controversial thing within the Legion, it made it very easy for the Legion to split. And it's entirely possible that not all of those who split from the Legion to stay loyal to the Emperor did so necessarily out of pure loyalty. It might also have been an opportunity just simply to escape Angron and to get away from the life of, violence and barbarism that they had very much been forced into and that they really probably didn't want to maintain. And then obviously that causes more of a problem for the remaining legionaries as they begin their slow conversion to the Blood God and become more about worshipping the violence they do rather than doing it out of necessity in many ways. And that's one of the subtle differences between why the World Eaters do what they do. When Angron was suddenly awakened to the Blood God, and obviously the World Eaters began to slide more and more into the worship of Khorne, you didn't just see the breakdown of the Legion, you also saw very much the end of Angron's reliance upon the Legion as well as a fighting force in some respects. He went from very much being another Primarch who was hampered by some limitations to being an avatar of Khorne. He finally had a master that he wanted to serve, that he was a little bit more enthusiastic about, because violence was all he'd ever known, violence was all he'd ever been about, and suddenly he is in a position to actually use that. As much as it's twisted and actually quite perverse when you sit down and think about it, it does hold a certain amount of sense. even if he can't have the end he wants, he can then spend eternity leaning into and doing the thing that he only knows how to do now. And whatever was left of Angron of Nunercia very much was left behind at that point. And when we then think about how that relates to the end of the heresy ends very much with Horus being destroyed and the coalition that he'd built up ending on a very low note as well. The legions shattered. But not only did his legion shatter, it shattered in such a way that almost made it impossible for him to recover from. So as we all know by this point, during the flight from Terra, the Emperor's children ostensibly at this stage started another conflict within the traitor legions by stealing slaves and attacking their former allies. This obviously culminated on Scalathrax, where the World Eaters Legion was formally shattered, as it was known. But the important thing to remember about Scalathrax is all that did was end the Legion as it was. That was the final nail in the coffin for some, but ultimately the World Eaters Legion had ended long before then. And you could say it ended at a number of different places. Did it end at Scalathrax, like some people did? Did it end when Horus fell above Terra and the legions began their retreat? Did the 12th Legion collapse the day Khorne took Angron into becoming a demon prince? Or did it collapse the day that Angron was returned to the Legion? And this brings us on to one of the saddest things about it, and it's a twofold question. Did Angron ever have a chance? And did his Legion ever have a chance? That's the big questions that hang over them. Obviously, to the first one, did Angron ever have a chance? Maybe, had he not had the nails put into his head, but ultimately that's not what happened. He did. But did the Legion ever had a chance? Would they have been the only Legion to reject their Primarch? Or could the Emperor have simply removed Angron from command of them? Or would they have insisted on having him as their Primarch and the Emperor just had to let them? It's really hard to say for certain, but what we do know is that a lot of those choices probably led to a lot of regrets. And it's hard to say who within the World Eaters Legion, especially after the heresy, could have seen a different path for them. And that then leads us onto a different question. Had Angron not been put in charge of the 12th Legion, would the whole Legion have stayed loyal to the Emperor? Would they have ever split off? There may have been some rogue elements. Some of the other loyal legions had rogue elements that went to Horus. But would the whole 12th Legion have splintered as quickly as it did at the outbreak of the heresy? What would have happened to those that didn't? And for Angron himself, who became a demon prince and is now sworn to Khorne for all time, is there anything left of Angron of Nunercia in his mind? Or is he completely gone? Is the Primarch, the intelligent Primarch who was in the most unfortunate position out of all of his brothers, unable to realise either himself? And I think that's one of the things about him which is really quite tragic, is that he was a Primarch with promise. He had a legion with promise, and that was taken away from him, not through choice, but through his own circumstance of his scattering. If nothing else, Angron is definitely the biggest victim of the scattering of the Primarchs. Of all of the Primarchs, he was the only one who was not really able to take control of the world he was on. He was the only one whose planetary culture did shape him, and it shaped his legion, but it shaped him both for the worst, and that's a fact. And as we can see going forward into the 41st millennium, after the First War on Armageddon, where he returns not as a conqueror, but simply as a slaughterer, he's never built anything as a Primarch or as a demon Primarch beyond towers of skulls. And we see that again and again when we come back to the World Eaters. That's the only thing they know how to do, and that is a shame. But in any case, I want to know your thoughts on that. Do you think that Angron is the most tragic Primarch? Do you think there was a second chance for him at some point, or his legion? Do you think there are other Primarchs who had a rougher deal than him? Do you reckon that there's another way of looking at this entirely? And do you think that Angron himself potentially could have been saved? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you. So there we have it, my take on the World Eaters lore and what it actually means to the World Eaters and to their Primarch. But let me know your thoughts below. Do you agree with what I said about Angron? Do you think differently about the Legion? Do you think there's more to be said there? Or do you think that maybe everything's wrong and they are fine the way they are? But in any case, let me know your thoughts below. And whilst you're down there, like, subscribe, comment, all that good YouTube shilly stuff. As some of you know, I post my videos on Wednesdays and Fridays. For those of you who don't know, I post my videos on Wednesdays and Fridays. But thank you all very much for watching, goodbye, and have a lovely day.